Welcome to the Birds and the Bees podcast. This is Braxton Dutson.
That's the key. People aren't talking about it.
Everybody needs to know that porn is not a documentary.
It's not like if we don't talk to kids about sex and sexuality, they're not going to hear about it. They're just not going to hear about it from us.
They have tons of questions, they just don't know how to ask them.
All you have to do is be one chapter ahead. You don't have to know everything. Just one chapter ahead of wherever your child is.
I sat down with Lisa Diamond of the University of Utah to discuss her research and findings on sexual fluidity. We discussed the complexities of sexual fluidity and how parents can best respond if their children or partner are experiencing changes in their sexuality. I really had a lot of fun talking with Lisa Diamond about this complex topic. I'm really excited to share this information with you because she has so much to share. She gives really good information and suggestions on how to go about doing that and how to accept the process that others have about the change you're experiencing. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to give us a call at 385-449-1818. You can also visit us at birdsandbeespodcast.com or on our Facebook page to leave comments and questions. I'm here with Lisa M. Diamond. She's a professor of psychology and gender studies at the University of Utah and author of Sexual Fluidity, Understanding Women's Love and Desire. That was a book that you wrote in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. One thing that as we're sitting down together, I really want to know what started you on this path of gender studies and the research that you did with this book?
I mean, largely when I actually began the research that led to this book when I was in graduate school back in the early 90s at Cornell University. And it wasn't all that well thought out. I was very interested in the sort of identity development of young sexual minority, in other words, non-heterosexual women, and I found that most of what I could find in the published research was on men. I think at that time it was easier to study men than it was to study women. Most of the folks doing that research, this was before the internet kind of took over, most of that research was based on folks going to bars or going to community centers or going to gay, lesbian support groups. And those sorts of community-based sites tended to draw more men than women at that point in time. Mm-hmm. And so most of the research that was done, would have this sort of disclaimer, this was a study of sexual identity development, but there were only 3 women in the youth group that we were talking to, so we decided to make it a study of men. And as a feminist, I was like, wow, like women's voices are not being represented. And so when I started out, it was pretty vague. I just felt like, we need to get women's voices back into this research area. And so I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I just felt like, okay, I need to put back in the voices that were missing.
It needs to be women's
and that
voices.
was the main thing. And so what emerged from that, a lot of it was just very unplanned and not all that well thought out. I always joke that I would never let my own graduate students do a project that was as unstructured as the project that I did. But it, ended up really revealing a lot of interesting corners of the sexual minority experience in terms of a lot more change and a lot more variability than I think had been represented at that point. But it, I didn't really know what I was looking for. I just kind of dove in. It's like someone dumping you in the pool and you just swim.
Really? So just jumping right into it, and that's why you're saying that it was more unstructured.
It was pretty unstructured.
Pretty unstructured.
And as I joke now with my advisor at the time, Rich Seven Williams at Cornell, who's a really just psychologist. I've joked with him in the years since then. I'm like, what the heck were you letting me do? Like, why didn't, like, I'm now an advisor of graduates. And like, why did you even let me do that? Like, I didn't know what I was doing and you just kind of let me go. And he always, because we're still close colleagues to this day, and he says, you know what, Diamond, I think you turned out okay. So, just relax. Like,
You're all right.
It was all good. It was all good.
Oh, man, that's good. So it kind of started all over in Cornell, and you were like, hey, we don't have a voice for the women in this fluidity place. Or were you searching sexual fluidity?
No, like, that wasn't even on my agenda. Like, I was just like, are women different than men? Like, what will happen if you talk to women? So I really wasn't, there was some suggestive stuff in the literature suggestive of fluidity, but it was really on older women and it was retrospective data. So I wasn't really looking for that or thinking about that at the time. I just figured I'm going to let the women's experience tell me what to sort of look for, which ended up being a good thing. But again, I would never let my own students
go that.
I'd be like, no, you need to have a hypothesis. You need to have like a plan. I didn't really have a hypothesis or a plan.
You just jumped right in.
I just jumped right in, and luckily it worked out okay.
When did sexual fluidity come out in your research, or when did you say, eureka, I've got this?
It wasn't really, it was like the opposite of a eureka moment. I was, I had all these interviews and I was coding them and trying to take the different experiences and figure out what was common to them and to come up with like a system for, okay, this sort of experience is common to all of them. And I felt like I could feel myself trying to kind of shoehorn certain experiences that didn't fit, that were a little bit odd, like, because I had a certain narrative in my head that was more consistent with the literature, and that was sort of suggestive of, if your past moved around a lot, it just because you didn't really know yourself very well. And then once you come into your true self, you look back and you say, I was misinterpreting everything that went before. And now I know the true, path of my sexual identity. Mm-hmm. And instead, what women were saying to me were things like, well, I had that relationship and it worked for that moment. And then I had this other relationship and it was totally different. And it worked for that moment. And I found myself trying to kind of fit it into this narrative of the false self changes to a true self. And yet what women were describing to me was that their true self was kind of complicated. And it wasn't one thing.
More than just black and white.
Yeah. And so I kept trying to find evidence where I could come up with some piece of their past that wasn't authentic. And I remember there was a point where I was on a long plane flight from, Cornell to visit my family in Los Angeles, and I'm coding all these interviews, and I finally stepped back for a second, or sat back in my uncomfortable coach seat, and was like, you are literally trying to force things into categories that don't fit. You're imposing your own expectations onto the research, which is exactly what you're not supposed to do. Mm. And I was like, you know what? I think, you need to start over. I had coded something like 20 interviews at that point. And I was like, you know what, Diamond? You need to start over.
Wow.
I don't think you're really listening. And so I sort of scrapped everything I had done, and I just went back to interview number 001. I was like, let's read these transcripts again.
So you didn't have to re-interview you? Well,
not re-interview, but reread because I had taken these I had to sort of reread everything and be like, maybe I'm wrong about what these women are experiencing. Maybe they're right and I'm wrong, because I wasn't really listening to their own voices. Oh. I felt like I was I had this idea of what was going on, and And, and that's not what science is. But, I was so sort of indoctrinated with what I thought sexual identity development was supposed to be that it was hard to let go of that.
Of the binary?
Yeah, or just that, there was a false self, and then you discovered your true self. And the real reality was that, true selves are complicated, and they are multiple. And that, some of the women who I was struggling to make sense of, who were like, oh, yeah, I've always been attracted to women and I'm a lesbian. But, then I had this weird thing with like my best gay male friend, and like we slept together and it was great. And I don't think I'm bisexual. I just think it was a one-time thing. And I was like, what?
Whoa.
Like, what's that about? And and I wanted to sort of discount that as some sort of false self. And what I found was that no, and no matter what your sexual orientation kind of is, it does not rule out experiences, emotional and physical experiences that kind of run counter to that. That human beings are a little bit more complicated than I think a lot of us would like to believe.
Yeah, than trying to put someone in a position where you get to choose heterosexual, bisexual, gay.
Yeah, and that's just going to be what it is forever and ever, and anything that doesn't fit with that is false.
It's a false self.
And that just
it's in between deciding whether you're in one of those.
Yeah, or just that you can be heterosexual and have a legitimate one-time only affair with a woman. You can be a lesbian and have a satisfying, legitimate, authentic, one-time only affair with a man. And that those experiences don't delegitimize your sexual orientation. They're just a part of the human condition. They're not denial. They're not false. It's just that the human experience, that having a sexual orientation doesn't rule out the ability to have experiences that seem to run counter to that orientation. And
so you're able to be a complex person without trying to explain it in a simplistic process. Yeah. So I guess with all that's brought into one, that brings in sexual fluidity. That's kind of encompassing it all. Is that right? What would, I don't know, if we had to sum it up, what would sexual fluidity, what would be the explaining part of sexual fluidity? How would we define it?
I define it as just a capacity for sort of erotic responsiveness, depending on emotions, depending on context, and I think it's important to note that I don't think all individuals are equally fluid. I know some individuals who are much more kind of stable and consistent in their sexual attractions and their erotic experiences, and others that are not. So I think it varies from person to person, but I think it is a part of our human sort of capacity for change. My feeling is that some individuals just have a little bit more wiggle room around their orientation than others. The way I like to think of it is that, sexual fluidity doesn't mean that you don't have an orientation. I believe that we do. I just think that orientation does not rigidly circumscribe every erotic experience you may have.
Gotcha.
And so you can have experiences that seem to go outside that boundary, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're bisexual or that you're crazy or that you're confused. It's just a part of the human capacity.
Yeah. You're normal.
Yeah.
Pretty much what it is. You have an experience. Is it almost kind of like I might say this, the Kinsey scale?
Well, the Kinsey scale, Kinsey developed the scale to represent behavior. He wasn't really thinking about orientation. He was just looking at patterns of behavior. But I do think it works pretty well. The idea is that, you have people who are on the extremes of orientation, who are nearly exclusively attracted to one sex or the other. And then there are some people whose orientations are somewhere in the middle ground. But fluidity is sort of, I think of fluidity as being sort of independent of orientation, that, you can be a fluid heterosexual or a stable heterosexual.
Mm-hmm.
You can be a fluid Kinsey 6 homosexual, or you can be a stable Kinsey 6 homosexual. That whatever your basic pattern of attraction is, it does not rule out the fact that you might meet someone or be in a circumstance somewhere in your life that might activate something that runs counter to that general pattern.
Would an example where, say, a couple wants to do a threesome or something along those lines, because that brings in a little bit of non-heteronormative or homonormative.
Yeah, and I think I can imagine. I've known couples who've talked to me about this, and I it's usually men wanting their women to bring another woman in. There's I've rarely seen heterosexual men being like, let's bring another man in.
Yeah.
And generally, I've talked to women who were like, I'm open to that, whatever, we'll see what happens. And other women who were like, I just don't think that I could do that.
Yeah.
And so I would say the women who were like, I just don't think that I can do that are pretty kind of non-fluid heterosexuals. The women who were like, you know what, I don't think women are my thing, but, we want to try this. I guess I'm open to it. I would say that's that capacity for fluidity. It's like, and if they do that and if they enjoy that, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're lesbian or bisexual. It means that they're a little bit more fluid, more open, more plastic in their ability to find something arousing that isn't their standard thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because this does seem to fall into the sexual fluidity of, if you're saying, well, yeah, I'm a heterosexual, or I'm, straight, completely homosexual.
Yeah.
But then you're bringing in different individuals. I mean, that starts to bend.
Yeah, and I think it gets confusing for folks, because they're like, oh, if I enjoyed that threesome, now does that mean that I am bisexual? And what I always say is maybe yes and maybe no. If you are someone who's consistently interested in both women and men, that's, kind of what we would consider to be bisexual. If you're someone who's consistently interested in the opposite sex, and then once in a while you're able to find a same-sex encounter erotic and satisfying, that doesn't necessarily mean you're bisexual. Maybe it does and maybe it doesn't, but it is possible for you to be kind of heterosexually oriented, but capable of experiencing same-sex desire and encounters. Similarly, I've talked to lesbians who were like, oh, I'm basically interested in women, but, I went home with a guy one night and it was okay. Like, it wasn't what I would have chosen, but it was fine. Does that mean that I'm bisexual? I'm like, well, are you consistently interested in women, or are you consistently interested in men? And they're like, no, I'm consistently interested in women, but I had this one experience. I'm like, well, then I would say you're a fluid lesbian. You're not necessarily bisexual. So the idea is that a consistent pattern of attraction doesn't necessarily rule out the capacity to have an experience that runs counter to that pattern.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What are some of the misconceptions of sexual fluidity?
I think probably the biggest one is that it's confusion or curiosity. It doesn't appear to be either confusion or curiosity. It just appears to be this capacity for experiencing something that is different than your pattern. The other big misconception is that it's bisexuality. And I think that's trickier, because I think because bisexuality as an orientation doesn't mean 50-50. And so there are some bisexuals who are like, I'm mainly interested in women, like 75% women, 25% men. And so it's hard to tell. It's like, okay, so are you bisexual or are you a fluid heterosexual? And I think that to some degree, that's like the $6 million question, because there's no necessary way to completely tell the difference between those two experiences.
And I think you cover some of that in your book, where if you're going to research, 70 to 30, it still puts you in a box of whether you're bisexual, heterosexual, or homosexual. And you're really trying to put people not on a scale, but more in a box.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And so, to some degree, my answer would be, to you, individual person, does it matter to you to know whether or not you are have a consistent orientation to both genders, or whether you are a fluid lesbian or a fluid heterosexual? If you're happy, if you are able to make the choices in your life that you want to, well, then the difference between bisexuality and fluidity is an interesting academic question for someone like me.
Mm-hmm.
But for you in your own life, as long as you feel able to make the decisions that you want to make, then maybe it doesn't matter.
So pretty much if it's important to me to know if I'm heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual, that's when it becomes an issue.
Yeah, and I would say to that person, why do you need to know?
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like having a bisexual orientation gives you a different kind of permission, or do you feel a need to cling to this notion of a heterosexual identity? Ideally, I view questions about the difference between orientation and fluidity interesting scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for life choices and for civil rights, my thing would be, what we really want is a society that says, we don't care how you came to want to be with whoever you want to be with. We should protect your right to be with whoever you want to be with.
Mm-hmm.
How you got to be that way is an interesting academic question. But in terms of your rights, you should be allowed to make whatever decision you want to make about your life and be safe and secure and not stigmatized, however you got that way.
Which seems to be more difficult, easier said than done, because it sounds like your research has been used on multiple sides.
Yeah. And I think a part of the problem is that for many years, starting back in the 60s, the LGBT civil rights movement sort of used the notion of, I'm born this way, and I can't change, and I didn't choose it, as a sort of proxy for our deservingness of rights. That, please don't blame me for being this, pathetic creature that I am. And I really think that we've gotten beyond that now. And I feel strongly, both as an activist and a scientist, that this science of sexual orientation should have nothing to do with American, rights of marriage and privacy. Either we're a society that protects individual liberty or we're not. How you came to love, I always use the example of interracial marriage. When those cases were decided in the 60s, no one said, were you born loving opposite-raced individuals? They were just like, wow, individuals have a right to love whoever they want to love and marry whoever they want to love, and laws against interracial marriage are wrong because it's not the government's business to tell you who to love and who to marry.
Fall in love with, yeah.
There was never, no one ever had to prove that they couldn't help, I was born this way. And I think that really the same applies to same-sex marriage and to LGBT civil rights. It doesn't matter how individuals got to be in same-sex relationships or other sex relationships. Either it's consistent with our values as Americans to protect individuals' privacy when it comes to sexuality and love. When anti-gay activists use my research to say, if it's fluid, then no civil rights protections apply because it's a choice. Where I'm like, well, it's a choice for white individuals to marry Latino individuals and for black individuals to marry white individuals. Those are choices. And we've already decided in this country that individuals have the right to make those choices.
Yeah.
There's no difference.
It's all in that choice. And that.
Yeah. Either we view sexuality and marriage and love as issues of personal liberty, or we don't.
Yeah. If there was a way for you to put down the fine line in between both of those parties and both those thoughts and beliefs, I think you've done it. To be able to start saying, all right, we've got a fluid place and you can't necessarily use it for your choice or you're born this way because it's all of the above.
And I think the reason the LGBT movement sort of started to use the born that way argument you can locate it very specifically in time. It goes back to Anita Bryant, who in the 60s and 70s was active in trying to pass laws against to basically forbid gay individuals from being allowed to be school teachers. And her argument was that homosexuals are trying to recruit your children because they cannot reproduce. And so, they are basically out there predatory. And so we can't have them as elementary school teachers because they will recruit your children. And she said distinctly, homosexuals are made, not born. And so then what did the LGBT civil rights movement do? We said, no, Anita Bryant, we're not doing that. We're not out to recruit your children. This is just the way we are. We are made. And so the Born That Way argument really came as a reaction to an attack against our community. And I think a lot of LGBT individuals were like, we don't know how we got this way. We just know that argument that we're trying to recruit your children is just wrong.
It's not true.
It's just wrong. And so then the Born That Way argument sort of took off and got its own head of steam and sort of became its own animal. But the argument we always should have been making, I think, was that it doesn't matter how we got to be this way. We are, United States citizens, and we deserve the same respect and
it's so complex.
Legal protections as everyone else. It doesn't matter whether you first knew you were gay at age 8 or whether you first knew you were gay at age 25. It doesn't matter whether you're bisexual or exclusively, same-sex attracted. Either we're a society that protects those basic dignities or we're not.
Yeah. And I like in your book, the thing that really helped me solidify and grasp this concept was when you compared it to a toddler, well, I guess an infant learning to crawl or learning to walk. Some do that 3 weeks early, some do it a couple months behind, wherever they would fall. And we don't tell the ones that learn 3 weeks early to say, no. That's not at this point in time. You have to wait. Or the ones like, what's wrong with you? You need to decide. Or a teenager that has been struggling with trigonometry and all of a sudden, bing, wow, I understand trigonometry.
We have a lot more allowance for just the vast diversity of human development in other areas than we have with sexuality. And the truth is that it's a complicated, variable thing. You see that cross-culturally. You see that historically. And I think we need to have a respect for that.
Yeah. So I'm curious as to how personal values affected the participants in your study. We bring all this in, and there's a lot of values that do shape us to who we are. Yeah.
I mean, I found that sadly, when values play a role, they tend to play a role in stigma. Some of my participants who were raised in very conservative religious traditions, struggled a lot more. And living in Utah, I've just seen that in my own students, that folks who were raised in the LDS church that has a certain, ideology about sexuality have a lot more difficulty loving and accepting themselves. And that's not specific to one tradition. I found that's true for Orthodox Jews, for Catholics, Orthodox religious traditions, and sort of restrictive traditions that have very restrictive norms about gender and sexuality.
That have the values that you kind of are given as you grow up in the certain, or are told that this is what we believe.
If you're not growing up in that mold, you're in trouble.
So how would that leads me to wondering? So this podcast is mainly for parents and individuals that have kids that might possibly be saying, "Mom, I don't fall under the heterosexual or even completely homosexual area, and I don't think I'm bi." How can parents help their children be how can they be the most supportive or learn to react in an appropriate manner to their kids?
It's really hard. And one resource that I would direct parents to, there's a wonderful I think it's like a 30-minute video on a website called Lead with Love. And it was produced by a colleague of mine, Dr. Dave Hebner. And it's designed for parents who are struggling with these issues. And their goal was to provide some information to parents on the web so that parents didn't have to go to a support group or talk to a therapist. They could just find good information. And it, interviews a lot of other parents dealing with these issues. And the big take-home message is that, you are entitled to all the confusing feelings as a parent that you're having, but you need to kind of separate those feelings from what your kids are going through, because they're going through their own stuff. And the word lead with love, the L stands for let your affections show. That what most kids fear the most is losing the love of their parents. And most parents are like, well, of course I still love my kid. Well, your kid may not know that. Mm-hmm. So let them know in whatever way is natural to you, whatever way is typical to you as a family. Like in some families, it's just having your regular Friday night movie nights, where you eat popcorn and you sit together. For other parents, it's physical hugs and kisses. Just whatever is your way of showing your affection to your child, keep that going. Then the E stands for express your own pain away from your child. That if you're struggling and if you're upset and you're confused and you're depressed, those are all normal feelings. Mm-hmm. Don't let your kids see them because they've got their own bad feelings. And if they see you hurting, they're going to feel guilty. So you are entitled to your own pain. You're entitled to your own struggle, but keep some appropriate boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Don't try and fix it through your teen.
Yeah, or don't tell your teen, you know what, you are making me more depressed than I've ever been in my whole life. Like, that's a valid feeling, but your teen doesn't need to know that because that's hard enough for them. So it's sort of like deal with your own issues. In the same way that you wouldn't tell your teen about marital problems. Mm-hmm. You'd be like, well, I need a boundary. Well, here's a place where you maybe need to set a boundary.
Yeah. Stress in the relationship may have increased since you have kids, but you don't tell your child.
Exactly.
You know what? We were so much happier before you came.
So it's like just know that you are absolutely right to be struggling and to have issues that you need to deal with, but you don't need to bring those into your relationship with your kid because they've got their own issues. The A in LEAD stands for avoid rejecting behaviors. That a lot of parents don't realize how much their kids are aware of every single thing that they do, and that even things that don't seem rejecting can feel rejecting to the child. And a lot of the interviews that I've done and that my colleague Dave Hebner and his colleagues have done, kids will say, yeah, my mom said, I really love you and I totally accept you, but could you just dress a little bit more, normal? Can you not wear that, your hair is just too, can you just look a little bit more conventional? And the parents are like, oh, that doesn't seem that bad. I'm just saying I love you. I just want you to dress a little bit more conventional. Mm-hmm. But what the child hears is rejection. And so to just be aware of the fact that children's perceptions of rejection are acute and they're very sensitive, and to try and avoid, seeming to reject the child. And then the D in LEAD is, and I find this the most compelling, do good before you feel good. In other words, even if you haven't quite come to a place of accepting your child and you're still working it out and you're struggling, just, it's sort of like fake it till you make it. Do the right thing for your kid, even if you're still struggling. Be accepting to them. Be loving to them. Even if you go back into your bedroom each night and you're like tearing your hair out and you're like, what the heck is going on? For the sake of that relationship, work that out in private and do the right thing for your kid. Love them, accept them, embrace them. While you're working it out in your own head, reach out and do what you know is the right thing as a parent, even if you're conflicted inside, because your kid needs the love and affection so badly. And you may not know where this ends up. It may take 1 year, 5 years, 10 years to resolve. But in the meantime, you want to protect that relationship with your kid. You don't want to have to repair damage later on. You want to do what's right for the relationship and for the well-being of your kid now.
And the reaching out could be something as simple, like you said, working it out in your head. But that's also a great time to reach out to a therapist.
Yes, if you're able to and if you're willing to, that'd be great.
Support groups, they have a lot of support groups now.
There are tons of them. But the point is that you not put your relationship on your kid, with your kid on hold until you've resolved all your issues.
Yeah.
And I'll use my own parents as an example of this. You know, I came out to my parents when I was 19, and it did not go great with my dad. It went okay with my mom. And but then it was like a great silence, was there, and like we didn't really talk about it. And I was like, wow, I guess everything's okay. I found out from my sister, who was a couple years older than me, years later, that they were like completely freaking out and, just messed up. But my sister had said to them, you know what, Mom and Dad, go to PFLAG, go to a therapist, do whatever you need to do, but don't burden Lisa with your distress.
Wow.
Just be loving, do right by her, protect your relationship with her. And so it was years later that I found out how upset they were. But in the meantime, I had the space that I needed to deal with my own stuff. And I think that that's sort of an ideal scenario, that it took them a while to come to grips with it. But like I always advise folks now, it took me years. I came out at 19. I was dealing with these issues for a while before I came out. My parents deserved just as much time as I had. They were sort of blindsided by it. They deserved to have the sort of time to wrestle with it, but they didn't burden me with that. They did that privately. And even though they were confused and my dad was sure that it wasn't real, he told me, like when I came out to him, he told me that I was just a really angry, political zealot. Okay, whatever. But they did not withdraw their love for me. They were, even though they may have been kind of gritting their teeth and really confused inside, they loved me unconditionally. And my parents, that relationship was preserved and protected. And I think it's sort of a success story.
And I think you said something very important there, that you had plenty of time wrestling, moving through this sexual fluidity, trying to figure out where you fit on for yourself. And I mean, you could be on stage 9 of trying to figure all this out. And like, okay, now I'm at a place that I can tell people they're starting back on stage 1.
Exactly. And why should I expect them to be where I am? If it took me a couple years to deal with it, why should I expect them to move at light speed? That's not fair.
Yeah, accept it now.
Yeah. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of teenagers make. They're like, hey, Mom and Dad, like this is where I'm at. And, we don't give our parents the same time that we needed. Yeah. And so one piece of advice I would say to parents is have the presence of mind to say to your kid, okay, you've just presented me with this. I'm sure it took you a long time to wrestle with this. Just give me the same time. Like, I'm going to do my best. Just give me the same time that you gave yourself.
Wow.
We all want to get to the same place, which is repair, which is connection. And just give me, I'm going to deal with my stuff. I love you, but I just be patient with me.
Yeah. asking for patience, and that's always appropriate.
Yeah.
Especially if you
Of course, teenagers are notoriously impatient. So a lot of teenagers would be like, "That's great, Mom. I'll give you a week."
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important for parents to say, "I'm going to absolutely send, like every bit of love toward you that I ever have. But I need you to know that I'm struggling, and I'm going to work on this on my own."
Totally. How can parents translate your work into productive and safe conversations on the nature of bonding and sexuality?
I think the important thing for parents is not to take every twist and turn in their child's life as indicative of a permanent future.
Oh, okay.
And I think parents are so anxious to know what's going to happen. Are you going to get married? Are you not going to get married? Are you going to have kids? Are you not going to have kids? Are you going to end with a woman? Are you going to end with a man? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? And so they look at every single event in the child's life as some piece of evidence. Oh, you're dating a woman now. So is it women now?
So are you lesbian?
Wait,
I don't know.
Now you're a man. Wait, what? How do you feel? And if anything, my research has shown that the past does not reliably predict the future. And so I think that parents need to relax a little bit and to try and ride each wave. Each relationship may be different, and to not try and use each event in their child's life as a diagnostic test for what's going to happen in the future, which is really hard because they really want to know what's going to happen in the future. But to some degree, it's like permission to just be where you are. If your child is in a relationship and you don't like that person, you know what? It may not go anywhere. So instead of trying to convince them to end the relationship, or alternatively, trying to convince them to stay in a relationship that you like, why don't you just sit back and listen? And listening to your kid and letting them have the space to make their own decisions. I mean, goodness knows, plenty of kids make decisions simply to oppose their parents. So often expressing your opinion about which partners you like or dislike can have the opposite effect, right? Oh, Mom likes this one, then I'm going to dump them. So I would say to parents, just hold on to that patience. Know that the past is not necessarily prologue to the future, and see how far you can get by just listening, and being there for your kid.
Is that a way for them to avoid shaming?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there other ways that we could help avoid shaming a child that is going through?
Again, remember that A part of LEAD, avoid rejecting behaviors.
Okay.
Be aware of your nonverbal behaviors. One of the stories that I've told folks, and I didn't even think it was that compelling a story, but several of my friends have said, wow, I keep remembering that. When my sister got married, and she was a couple of years older than I was out at that point, and I was with my partner, who I've now been with for, oh my goodness, 22 years now. But we had only been, I think we've been together for about 5 years when my sister got married. I don't remember. Anyway, during the wedding, I remember seeing the look on my father's face, when, watching my sister kind of, come down the aisle. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm never going to see that look on my dad's face. Like, there's no way he's ever going to celebrate any union that I have as much as he's just deliriously happy to see my sister get married. And for years after that, my now wife, because we are now legally married, we talk about getting married, and I would say to her, I said, I'm ready to commit to you in that way, but I don't think I can go through a wedding ceremony until I am comfortable enough in my mind with the possibility of seeing disappointment on my father's face. Wow. And until I've resolved that for myself, and gotten beyond that sort of like childlike need for his approval, then I don't want to taint our wedding with that. And, we ended up getting married, and, all was well. I mean, I think my dad was always ambivalent about our relationship, but I think I made the right decision in waiting until I felt like I didn't need that to go on.
That approval.
Yeah, but the fact that was such a kernel inside of me, even though I was like, I'm this strong feminist, I'm confident in every way, but there's a certain part of every child that no matter how accomplished they are, no matter how good the relationship with their parent is, they want that parent's approval. Mm-hmm. And I don't blame my father for having his own ambivalence. This was a man who was born in 1941. It's like he had a whole different cultural background. I don't blame him for that. And I don't think he knew ever how much I was affected by that. And so I would just say parents need to know how the most subtle things. And it wasn't ever that he looked at me with rejection. It was me being able to see the look of joy on his face when he looked at my sister getting married and thinking to myself, he'll never look at me that way.
And it's all nonverbal.
Yeah. And it's all in our own expectations.
All expectations,
those things are so subtle. And so I think parents might be thinking, I'm trying to do everything right. Why is my child so upset? Well, it's because of those experiences like I had, where your child has been imagining and agonizing over things that haven't even happened yet, mm-hmm. because of just the cultural context we're living in.
Yeah.
And so I think it's valuable for parents to be aware of that and to then have the confidence to say, what are you afraid of? Do you want to ask me anything? Like, I have a feeling that you think that I disapprove of you. Mm-hmm. Am I right?
So if you start noticing changes in your child's behavior, bringing up that question and listening.
Up, say, you know what? I'm afraid you think that I'm disappointed in you. Mm-hmm. And I may still be struggling with this, but I love you with a passion, with a devotion that you can't even imagine. And the fact that I'm still struggling with this doesn't mean that I don't love you. And I don't want anything to stand between us, ever.
Wow, and that in of itself is so powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I remember my mother telling me once, and this was very soon after I came out. It was like a year after. She had gone to like a Christmas Day like brunch or something at a friend's house, a friend that she didn't even really know very well. It was just one of those like open house Christmas Day. And she said that someone was saying something about, gay people. And this was, she was still reeling from me coming out to her. And she said that in that moment, she just was like, she sort of clasped herself and she said to this woman that she didn't even know, well, you know what? I have a different response to that because I have a gay daughter and I love her. And so I just want you to know that, like, I have a gay daughter.
Wow.
And so there. And she told me that, not immediately after. She told me that like 6 months afterwards. And that for her, it was her on the kind of reckoning with like, oh my God, I'm the mother of a gay daughter.
It's kind of a coming out for her.
Yeah, and that she hadn't even kind of come to peace with it yet. Mm-hmm. But she was struggling. And when she told me that, I was like, it just melted my heart that she hadn't resolved it enough for herself. But she had, in that moment, she was showing me that she was struggling, but that, like, she was like, yes, I have a gay daughter. And in her mind, she's like, I don't know what the heck that means, but God knows I'm going to protect her and defend her and defend my relationship with her. Mm-hmm. And that sort of impulse of, I don't know where this is going. I don't know what this means, but I know that I love my daughter And that if I sense any threat to my daughter, I'm going to defend her like the mama bear that I am. That really rocked me. That even when she was still confused, that core of, I'm still struggling, but one thing I know is that I'm your mother, and you are my child, and we are connected beyond anything else.
That is so powerful to know you've got that connection, to feel that love. And if there's a theme to all this, it really sounds like showing love, just following the lead. I love that there's the lead that you've demonstrated to us, because that love and that being there for your child, their sexual identification is a part of them, but they're still your child.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that love that you had for them prior to them saying, hey, I'm not sure about all this, let that love still be there.
Exactly.
No matter what your value system is.
That's what's going to carry you through.
Yeah.
That's what's going to, and it's going to carry you through all the other stuff that your children are going to do that you don't like either.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to choose a job you don't like. They're going to ask you for money and they're not going to pay it back. The one thing is that bond. Mm-hmm. And that should go beyond everything.
Yeah. And I get asked as a therapist, what caused blank to happen? Why is my child, what would have caused my child to be gay? What would have caused my child to be so
The one thing
curious?
we know is that you as a parent didn't cause it.
Yeah.
The only cause that we've ruled out is parents.
So the parents have been ruled out of this situation.
Parents have been definitively ruled out. You weren't too close. You weren't too distant. You didn't hold them too long. You didn't neglect them enough. The one thing we know is that there's nothing you did that did it. And we don't know why people are the way that they are. And all we know is it's not your fault. And all you should care about is the quality of your relationship with your child.
So be reassured that it's not your fault and that it's so much more complex than one thing, two things that happened. It is your child's life, and that this continues on. It doesn't. This conversation we're having, we've been talking about teens and children. However, it goes way.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. When I was in graduate school doing this research, I had a roommate who was my best friend in graduate school, who was also a lesbian, and she was like, "Oh, you're doing all this stuff on fluidity, but I'm just like." I'm about as lesbian as they come. And I was like, that's great. And she ended up getting married to another woman, and they actually had a baby together. And then they got divorced. And I found out, through I reconnected with her on Facebook and stuff. And this is, 20 years after we've been in graduate school together. She just married a man.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was like, oh my God, you are the example of my whole book. And she was like, well, I don't know, Diamond. Life is complicated. So it doesn't necessarily need to be something that happens in the teen years. Mm-hmm. I mean, fluidity is a lifelong phenomenon.
Completely. So you may be having this conversation or even experiencing everything we just said with a 25-year-old.
Exactly. Or a 40-year-old.
Or a 40-one. Yeah.
Or a 50-year-old. I mean, that's the thing. It's like it's not restricted to any stage of life. It's at any time.
Totally. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for having me in your wonderful home and answering all these questions and talking about sexual fluidity. This has been a real privilege.
I appreciate it.
This has been another episode of the Birds and Bees podcast. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions about the show, comments, or questions you would like addressed in another episode, please give us a call at 385-449-1818. Leave your voicemail and your question, or you can also email us at birdsandbeespodcast@gmail.com or visit us online at birdsandbeespodcast.com.